Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am so excited that you are all here for the third in our webinar series of the Birdability Outreach Program. I'm pinning Virginia and Mark right now. I'll pin myself for a moment as well. And we are really grateful for you being here. We are also incredibly grateful to the terrific folks at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation for their ongoing support of Birdability's programming, and especially for the Birdability Outreach Program, of which this webinar series is a part. This is our third, as I mentioned, in the outreach series of webinars. And our next one, I just want to flag for you, is on the 12th of February. And that will be an introduction to mindful or slow birding. And then on March 12th, we have an opportunity to talk about adaptive equipment and birding for folks with disabilities. And we'll be joined then by Paul Miller, as well as a number of other folks who will talk about the kinds of adaptive equipment that make birding possible for them and most joyful for them. I want to remind folks that at the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says CC. That is closed captioning. We have enabled closed captions, so all you'll need to do is click on that and select show captions. And when you do that, you will be able to choose whether you would like to see captions below or a full streaming caption to the side. So please choose whatever helps create more access to this webinar for you. I also want to acknowledge we are recording our conversation today, and that this will be available later on YouTube as a part of our overall series. And that we're really grateful for questions or comments. Please participate in the chat as you would like. My name is Kat Fribley. I probably should have said that at the beginning. I am the executive director at Birdability, and I'm joining you today from Iowa City, Iowa, which is the original and current homeland of Meskwaki Nation. And I'm so grateful to be joined by both Virginia Rose and Mark Paller today. And we're going to jump into this conversation, which is about birding from accessible trails and public spaces. And in so many ways, this is what birdability is about, is creating access to the natural world. And Virginia, I'm wondering if we could start with you, and if you would be willing to just share a little bit of the story behind the founding of Birdability.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much, Kat, for being with us, and Mark. Excited to be sharing the panel with you. Thank you also for everybody. Emily, what a great smile. And let's see, I'm talking to Greg Power, the peregrine. What a great scowl. Anyway, hi, everybody. So, about 6 years ago, I realized that in my 15 years of birding, I had seen no disabled people on the trails. As I was nearing retirement from teaching, I thought, well, maybe I can find all those disabled people who just don't know about birding. And so really that's what happened. The big fickle finger of fate came down and pointed at me and said, you in the wheelchair who birds. And so at that point, I was able to get in touch with Audubon, National Audubon, and they asked me to come to Milwaukee for a convention wherein I was able to conduct a workshop and get some attention, and some video was released. And honestly, at that point, the rest I feel like was just saying yes to all of these people who were clamoring for this opportunity. And I really had no idea it was going to be such an amazing time, but it was time. It was Birdability's time. And we just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
I'm so grateful, Virginia, for the fact one of the things you say all the time is I'm just someone who birds from a wheelchair. Like that's
Right.
my criteria. And you were also so much more, right? In the fact that you, as you birded from a wheelchair, you were looking around and saying, where are the other visible like disabilities? Where are the other folks who are using adaptive equipment? I don't, I'm not seeing them. I'm not finding community yet. And then you set out and you built something. That allowed you to find other folks and for other folks to find you, right? Because I think that ended up being, it seems like so much of it. Am I right about that?
Oh, right. As I said, it was just the time for
Mm-hmm.
it. And so many people were ready, and
Mm-hmm.
we were just able to connect with all kinds of various birding
Mm-hmm.
organizations across the country who were so anxious to
Yeah.
make their birding sites accessible. And the mission is threefold. First is to introduce disabled people to birding.
Mm-hmm.
The second is to help make birding sites accessible to all people. And third is to help create a welcoming and inclusive
Mm-hmm.
environment. So we're working to make all three of those things happen at the same time. And
Mm-hmm.
it's turning out to be a lifelong um, project for as many people as we can get
Yes.
on it. So,
Yes, which is a terrific place to say, Mark, thank you for being a birdability captain, part of this birdability community, and a panelist here today. When I was thinking about this panel, you were one of the people that popped immediately into mind for me. I'm wondering if you could talk about how you found your way to birdability and what really inspired you to become a birdability captain and create these accessible birding outings that you have been leading and organizing in Minnesota.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. I live in Minneapolis, and I have muscular dystrophy. And about 6 or 7 years ago, when it started getting difficult for me to walk distances or to stand long, I started using a power wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that was when I started birding because I couldn't backpack or wilderness canoe, but I wanted to be outdoors. And so
Mm-hmm.
birding was a way to be outside. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of stumbled my way through. The president of the local Audubon chapter, who I had met just out at some of the birding sites, came up to me and said, Mark, you're the only person I've ever seen birding in a wheelchair, just like Virginia's story.
Mm-hmm.
Said, how would you like to help us develop some programming?
Mm-hmm.
And this is about the time that Virginia was working with Audubon, but at that initial time, I wasn't so aware of that. And
Yeah.
so actually, we developed a few programs for people with mobility challenges. And
Mm-hmm.
right after that got started, within a year or so, I learned about birdability and then the opportunity to become a captain. And I thought that was wonderful because it would tie me to others
Mm-hmm.
and get so many great ideas of how to do things differently from the way we
Mm-hmm.
were stumbling around doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just exploded from there in terms of the opportunities for people. Obviously, you're going to talk about it, but
Yeah.
the Birdability Map is a great
Mm-hmm.
resource for people, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I love for both of you. You're like, people saw you on the trail and recognized I'm not, I don't see many other folks with visible disabilities. So it clued them into needing something different, right? Around access. I'm curious about, Mark, when you were starting off in Virginia, I know a deep part of how you came to this was beginning to identify accessible trails and public spaces for birding. Tell us a little bit, you two, about what criteria did you use then and how has it changed to be able to meet as many needs as possible for folks with disabilities to be able to be out and birding in the natural world?
Mark, do you want to start off?
Okay, sure. Well, so I mean, I start off on just a personal
Yeah,
exploration. Where could I go and what trails could I access? And it was hit and miss, and
yeah,
tried some, and some were easy, some were harder. But I learned what I could do, and I really that was a major learning experience, and I took
yeah.
that to when we started doing programs. The other thing I've learned from some of the programs, the different styles of programs we've done, is you're not going to help, you're not going to be accessible for everybody. And I've come around to making sure that people just know what to expect
Yes.
from any trail or any event that we're holding, and people can select. So I go on a lot of birding events by birding organizations that I have to call the organizer to find out, whether I'm going to be accessible, but those are my own criteria.
Yep.
And I'm pretty risky. I know that I might get stuck out in the woods for 3 or 4 hours someday. I always have warm clothing with me and a telephone if it works. But for the events that we're doing, I'm trying to make it the most accessible for the most
Yes.
people. And then if people find that that's too limiting and they want to go out for more hours, some people have found after coming to our events that they're joining regular
Yeah.
birding groups.
Yeah.
Or going out on their own and feel more comfortable. So I think you have to define up front who you're going to reach. The needs for a trail for Virginia, who uses a manual wheelchair, versus me, who uses a lightweight but pretty powerful power chair, are very different. Even saying, oh, let's do something for people in wheelchair, that's very, very different criteria. So I think it's best to just tell people what to expect, and they can decide for themselves.
And that seems like such a great moment to really reiterate the fact that when we talk about accessible, that's really shorthand, but there's never something that's accessible for everyone, because we all, those of us with disabilities or chronic health concerns, have, and honestly, just with lived experiences, have different needs and different access needs. And so I really appreciate the way Birdability was founded on information sharing, much as you're talking about. How do we get as much information about public lands, trails, etc., into the hands, brains, hearts of folks, so that they can make decisions not only for themselves about what's accessible, but also, if they're decision makers, which almost everyone is in one way or another, about what could be changed to make it more accessible for more people. Virginia, how would you piggyback on that and talk about the criteria you use for yourself, for your outings?
Right. Well, I've been in a wheelchair 51 years, and I'm a paraplegic. I was injured early when I was 14. But all that's to say is I was pretty strong for quite a long time and could do a lot of trails that just I happened to be able to do. But when the birdability idea came around, all I knew to do was to create categories for myself. And I started with parking lots, talked about curb cuts, talked about restrooms, talked about surfaces, talked about slopes, talked about railings. And so I think initially, Kat, there were 9 categories, and they only applied to me in my lived experience. And I just want to reiterate what Mark said and what Kat said, which is there is no way that any one person could understand what all the disabilities require. And so the whole point of birdability is not to come in and put an accessible stamp on everything. No one can do that. So you should see the relief on people's faces when I explain that our job is to, like Mark said, provide objective information about these categories such that everybody can make his or her own decision based on his or her own disability. So thank goodness, I also wanted to say something that I think is really important in just in terms of philosophy. My sub motto is you won't know until you go. And I say that because I think if we sit long and hard thinking about whether or not we can do something, that we're always going to find a reason not to go. We won't know if we can do a thing until we go, and then we'll see. So there's a certain amount of exploration
Mm-hmm.
required. I think when we talk about getting out on a birding
Mm-hmm.
trail, that's not to say that you cannot do some information seeking ahead of time.
Absolutely.
Certainly. And I'm with
Mm-hmm.
Mark. I call for 20 years of birding. I called the field trip leaders ahead of time
Mm-hmm.
and basically to let them know that I was perfectly capable of being on my own on the path
Mm-hmm.
and I would do what I could, but I was just as happy to be left in the parking lot birding on my own and not to be concerned at
Mm-hmm.
all about my
Mm-hmm.
experience, that I was in charge of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like that's a way for us to empower ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to rely on our own independence, and to be
Mm-hmm.
able to find the joy that we do find when we're birding. So,
Absolutely.
I would say
And I just,
also,
oh, I was just going to add or interject that you know
please,
me and my both and. I'm constantly both anding you and everyone and both anding myself.
right.
So much so those are my tattoos that I look at every day, both and. Because
Yes,
I think
yes,
that there is this absolute importance to not having someone assume what we are capable of as people with disabilities.
right.
And at the same time, that there is this pairing of relief and joy when there is something that is made for me, when there is something that you know what I mean, that says from the
Yes,
outset, we have been thoughtful about access and where we're
right.
going and what is going to be possible. Here's the information so you can make good decisions, and recognizing that there is like a balance, right, of both of those things, of you don't know until you go. And sometimes I am frankly capable of things I would not have guessed in the moment, right? And the joy of community and the joy of sort of accessibility when there is something that is designed specifically with my needs in mind. And I think birdability is this beautiful fusion of
Yeah,
those two things.
agreed.
Mhm. So I know that when you were beginning this, you both talked about like you were scoping initially for your own needs, right? And one of the things that I'm a big believer of is disabled joy. Tell me about a moment, if you all would, when there was a memorable experience for you birding at an accessible location. Tell me about what made it special, what made it joyful, because I think the more stories also that we tell and remind people about the ways that birding brings joy to all of us is really important. Mark,
Yeah.
are you willing to start us off?
Sure, but you're not going to like my answer because there's not a,
Go for it.
I can't remember a single moment. I, I just love getting out every time
Yes.
I hang some binoculars around my neck and unload my wheelchair with my electric hoist out of the car and then go off in the woods.
Yes.
And if I see a bird, I'm happy. Yeah, now it's great if I get a lifer. It's even better if I get a rarity, if I stumble it on my own. But it's
Yeah.
joyful every time. And so yeah,
Mm.
and sometimes you go to a place and it's really not very accessible, but like Virginia said, so you stay in the parking lot and you're probably going to have a lot of luck anyway. Um, so each and every time.
I love that answer, actually. It doesn't, that's not an upsetting answer at all. That's the most delightful answer each and every time. I love that. And I think we have a whole realm of parking lot birding that all of us can talk about as some of the best birding, because simply being in the space sometimes means we see them without having to do as much work. Virginia, I hear you talk about that all the time. Is there one in particular you'd like to share, Virginia?
Oh, yes, I always refer to this one because it was
Mm,
such a eureka moment for me. I was in East Texas
mm,
and I was with a group of about 8 birders and we were at the Big Thicket. And
mhm,
so the Big Thicket is accessible for about 100 yards. And then the rest of the folks marched up the mountain. I was perfectly happy. They left me on a bridge. It was
mm,
dawn chorus. It
Mm,
was so loud. It was so filled with bird song. And I was identifying, yellow-throated warbler
mhm,
and yellow warbler and, all of these East Texas migrating
mhm,
warblers. And I was sitting on the bridge and it just sort of, I was
mhm,
astounded. I felt
mhm,
astounded with the bird song. And
mhm,
I realized right then I am the happiest I have ever been.
mhm, mm,
And I thought, and I am experiencing my best self right this
mhm,
moment. I mean, it was just resounding.
mhm.
So I would say that was it for me.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Mark, like you, much of the time, my answer is whatever my last birding adventure was. That is the thing that brought me joy. And I will share with you all, I'm multiply disabled. One of the disabilities that I have is a visible mobility disability, and I use a crutch, a forearm crutch to navigate the world. And Virginia, it's funny when you were talking about, you were strong and powerful because when you and I met up in April to go birding, you were such a badass in that wheelchair, outpacing me by far. I was like, I'll just be waiting on this bench over here. Because it really is, it's so different based on your body's abilities and needs. And you were like up that hill, and I looked at that hill and thought that will do me in for the whole day if I do that. I'm going to wait here. But while I waited there, I got to see the only yellow rumped warbler of the trip. And everybody else was like, oh. So it is such a funny thing because wherever you are, there are the birds, right? Like that is the joy of it. Um, Part of what grew really out of your experience, Virginia, of finding those places in Austin and then like really sort of morphed into something national is the Birdability Map. Can you talk a little bit about how the Birdability Map came to be and how it's evolved some in the time since then?
Yes, that was a dream. I was speaking. It was my very first workshop, um, and I was dreaming out loud that I had discovered at least 30 birdable spaces,
Mhm,
accessible birding spaces in Austin. And because I led beginning bird walks, I was very familiar with those.
mhm,
And, my greatest wish was to get in my van and drive around the country and go from accessible birding site to accessible birding site on my
yeah.
road trip. So I voiced that out loud in that workshop, and two GIS story mappers who were in the group approached me immediately after and said, we
Mhm,
can do that. And we
mhm,
can make a map where we identify accessible or birding
mhm,
sites that can be assessed for
mhm.
access all over the country with
Yeah,
crowdsourcing. And 5 months later, they sent me a draft
amazing.
based on the comments that I had made, the access
Mhm,
considerations I had made, and then
mhm,
6 months later it launched.
mhm.
Now I'm not sure what the number is now, but I think it's well over 1,700
We're
sites.
almost at 1900 now. Mhm,
1,900 sites in the
mhm.
country where people
And
have,
beyond,
and beyond
and
15 other
beyond.
countries.
Yes.
So really the dream has come true in that I
Mhm,
can get in my van
mhm,
and I can't, and I wanted, like, I'm like HBO, here I
mhm.
come. I want cameras. I want to have a party at every single accessible spot with all kinds of
Mhm,
disabled people there. Can't you guys see it?
mhm.
Nod yes if you can see it. Nod
Oh,
yes if you
yes.
want me to come to your site. So anyway, since then it has just increased. It's become a real point of pride for
Mhm.
people. So when I'm talking to Birdability or when I'm talking to sites, I say,
Mhm.
I know you want your site to be on the Birdability map.
Mhm.
I know you must want that very much. What can we do to make that happen? And they're all on board. As soon as Kat, you've seen it, like as soon as we're on a
Mhm.
Zoom presentation and I show them how the map is working and I
Mhm.
say, let's see how many birding sites are pinned on the Galveston Island. Oh,
Mhm.
none. What are we going to do about that? And so everybody's up in arms, in
Mhm.
Galveston. And so
And
everyone
the
heads
next
out.
thing you know, we have 36 in Galveston
That's right.
because people heard that and said, oh, we know there are great spots. We know
Right.
there are spots that we can share this access information about, and we want people to know. And so now we do have all of these really like terrific spots in Galveston. And you're right, that happens across, so many places when we have those conversations
That's
and
right.
share with people the power that they actually have in just reporting back. We
Yes.
know we're not, sometimes people will say, well, it's not perfect. It's not perfectly accessible. And we're like, nothing's perfect. The map isn't perfect. The site isn't
No,
perfect. We're not perfect. There's no
no,
such thing.
no.
Tell us what's there. We're going to be constantly working to find more places that we can share that information and that provides the opportunity for folks to dream. Like when you said dream out loud, Virginia, that makes me like, yes, let's dream out loud about all the places and all the joy that is awaiting folks at those sites and with that information. And I'll just remind everybody, you can visit the Birdability map. I'm going to put it in the chat and see what is in your community. As we do that, I'm curious, Mark, if you could start us off on just talking a little bit about challenges, because there's tons of joy, but there are also challenges when it comes to access and accessible birding. And I'm curious about challenges that you have found or faced in finding or advocating for accessible birding places. And then how did you address them? What was your approach?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest challenge again is different people need different things. And so my accessibility needs are not as stringent,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, because the chair has a battery and
Yep.
it's two motors and whatever. So that's the biggest challenge, I think.
Mhm.
But conditions change.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
and no matter how good the description is, even if someone has gone out and measured the slope to the degree, you can't predict when there's going to be leaves that may or may not be a problem, or twigs,
Yes.
or down trees, or
Yes.
in our case nearby, the closest state park to me is at the intersection of the Minnesota and Mississippi River, which is just a
Mm.
fantastic place to bird. But twice in the last 4 years, the Minnesota River is flooded and it's
Yes.
been closed. When it's totally closed, then everybody knows they don't let you in the park.
Yeah.
But then some of the trails will have a little bit of mud or a little more mud,
Mhm.
or be so far underwater you're not sure how deep it is.
Mhm.
And those are the kind of things that you can't plan for, and you just have to
Mhm.
be ready for
Yes.
things not working. That there's going to be a tree down and you're just going to have to abort your walk. Or I've
Yeah.
actually been out by myself, pretty far out, and my battery died.
Mm.
And I'm prepared mentally that when that
Mhm.
happens, I'll call someone, and within 3 hours, someone's going to come out with a four-wheeler and rescue me. But this
Mhm.
time, someone walked by, and I got him to pushed my chair for me for about a little more than a quarter mile to where
Yeah.
the car was. I misjudged how much charge I had left. And you just have to
Mhm.
be prepared for those kind of things. When
Yep.
we go out for walks with other people, I try to make
Yeah.
sure that I've scoped it out within the last,
Yeah.
so that we know what to expect. But again, the other thing that we do for our events
Mhm.
is we describe the actual walk. So
Yes.
that's a lot less than a park or what you find
Yes.
on the Birdability map, which is more
Yes.
extensive. So we may have decided that even though there's a mile and a half of paved, flat
Mhm.
trail, we're only going to do 100 feet and then sit at benches, or I'll tell people to bring your own
Yeah.
portable stools, because that's what we're going to do. And so for organized event, I find that approach even additive to what we could find on Birdability. And we're trying to do that I'm trying to do that for all the events that we do in Minneapolis Audubon. St. Paul Audubon has heard about what we're doing, and now I'm working with them. So be careful of success.
Right.
As Virginia knows, it just gets you working on more and more things, but it's wonderful to have people interested in that. And they can do it on their own. We don't have to do it ourselves. We've got everybody else thinking about that.
Yeah. Isn't that
So,
really like that building community? Sorry, go ahead, Virginia.
I just wanted to follow up on something Mark said, because I think he tried to just gloss over it. Mark, you said when the water was up, you couldn't tell how deep it was, implying that you would go through it in your chair if it was shallow enough. Yes?
Yeah. So my chair happens to be water resistant, and I bought it for that reason. And I can go through 6 or 8 inches of water
Oh, yeah. Wow.
routinely. In fact, that's how I clean the mud off the wheels. I intentionally go through clean water. But what I can't do is if it's 2 feet deep, if it's going down, if it's a trough, I don't want to do that. I don't think. I don't want to submerge the battery top and bottom. I don't care if it gets wet briefly. So that's but again, like you said, Virginia, that's not true of the vast majority of power chairs.
Right.
Almost none of them
Right. So
have that capability.
I love that little story because that's so indicative of my saying, which is no one can predict what a person with a disability can or cannot do. Oftentimes, not even the person.
Right.
So that's classic. I love it. I have a few pictures of me with water up to my spokes too. So I love those. Those are fun. I didn't want you to just squirrel away with that and not let us. Yeah, I love it.
Oh, it's really, one of the things where we're, sort of, what I'm hearing from you all is obviously we know trails and birding sites, public lands, natural spaces are the access features are different for everybody in terms of what they need. And that makes me also want to go back and add a comment about the map quickly. Because one of the things I didn't know is that initially, before I came on board at Birdability, was that you could filter on the map by the access feature you specifically need or are looking for. And I just feel like it's really important to share that because for any one of us, maybe there's one thing in particular. For some people, that is access to a bathroom. For some people, it's sit spots or benches that are really common. For other people, it might be guide ropes, especially for folks who are blind or low vision, who they can then navigate on their own. Because another thing, Virginia, I hear you talk about a lot, and I agree 1,000%, is that it's not actually accessible if I can't do it on my own, if I can't navigate it by myself. And Mark, I both adore and also am terrified for you when you were telling the story about like, I'll just go out, I know it's probably going to be 3 hours at the most. And to me, that is that sort of importance of nobody knows what we can do. Nobody knows what we want to do. And we don't have to have anybody else know what we want to do or what we can do, because part of the joy I think all 3 of us have expressed is in being able to just go and have that experience. And, for myself, part of my goal was I had this goal of birding in all 50 states by the time I turned 50 years old. And I was able to do that in 2019. But it meant a lot of times I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And sometimes that meant my outings were shortened. I'm curious about, Virginia and Mark, how you all have navigated situations. Mark, you've already shared a little bit about this, but where a trail or a space was labeled accessible, because this happened to me regularly, but actually had really unexpected barriers as a part of it. Virginia, are there any times that come to mind immediately for you around that?
Um, yes, except it's always my fault because I frequently go on trails that aren't labeled accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I always think, oh, I can do it. I'll figure it out. That's my MO, is like, I'll figure it out when I get there. And so I was following along on a field trip at a place called Commons Ford. And I had been there many times before,
Mm-hmm.
but this place, it had rained and rained and rained. And so I was concerned about the mud, but I, as usual, just jumped right in on all fours. And I'm wheeling along in deep grass and terrible mud, and pretty soon I just cannot budge.
Mm-hmm.
And all the walking people are, going on ahead of me. And I knew the leader really well, and
Mm-hmm.
so he kind of looked at me like, "What?" And I'm like, "Just go, just go." And so I spent at least half an hour with my gloves and chunks of grass
Mm-hmm.
trying to pull the mud like
Mm-hmm.
off. It was just globbed on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent about at least half an hour trying to just get my
Mm-hmm.
wheelchair turned around, heading
Mm-hmm.
back up the hill. And it was kind of a nightmare.
Yeah.
But, even at the end of that, I'm joyful that I
Mm.
could be in the middle of that. That
Yeah.
scene is fine. That's all part of it.
Mhm.
I'm just happy to be participating at any level, basically.
I really hear that. I so hear that. I want to acknowledge, I see a couple things in the chat that I'd love to just, for a second, take a minute and check in with folks about. Somebody asked if it was okay to add the Birdability Map into their own link tree on their socials. Please, Steph. Yes, absolutely. Put the map link everywhere and anywhere you can. We adore that. We want to share it. We want to get it out broadly with folks. Then the other thing that I see in the chat that I do want to address is about adding video and pictures. So currently we don't have video capacity, although that is something I think that is on the to-do list, on the ask about whether we can make that happen, because we've been talking internally in the captains group about um, uh, additional kinds of map features that we would like to see and changes and tweaks to the map. We've got lots of dreams for it. So video is one of them, just so you know, in part because that can be such a terrific way for someone to assess their own accessibility, whether that would be accessible to them. Photos, though, we can have up to 8 photos, and we really encourage folks to have photos. Jamie, terrific comment, said even if link for a YouTube video would be helpful, we could work on that way quicker than getting the ability to upload video, undoubtedly. And I will also share 2 things. There is now, and this speaks to, Mark, the flooding issues that you were talking about, the downed trees. Virginia, it speaks to the mud. We recently, in this last year, instituted a comment section in the map. So if you are on a site and it says, usually, this is what the conditions are, but what you found is that, in fact, due to a tornado or winds or something, there are downed trees that mean that is no longer the case. There's a comment section for some shorter term condition pieces that are important to know or important to share. So please feel free to use those. Those have to be moderated, so you'll see it go, or it'll go in, I'll see it and make sure that it is appropriate and that it belongs with that site, and then approve it. And that, I just wanted to mention, because it can be a really terrific place for information that isn't long-term change to that site review, but is about those current conditions and how they could really make things difficult. And then the other thing that I just wanted to name there is you are absolutely welcome to put in process or to put in site reviews in. I see somebody saying, what's the process for getting it approved? Because of the fact that this is a crowdsourced map, we rely on folks to give us correct information. And obviously, that's not always the case. And we know that there have been cases where the information is outdated or something comes up. That's another place where comments can be really helpful. If somebody puts in a comment, hey, the actual core information in this I'm finding to not be true, then I can go in and change it, or one of our interns, or one of the folks that works at National Audubon. So comments section is really valuable for that as well. Outside of that, Julie, there isn't necessarily a process for getting it approved. As long as you review it and I or the folks at National Audubon take a look at it and it is respectful and it is seemingly accurate, it's posted. You're good. We're ready to go. And then the thing is that those comments provide the space or the opportunity for folks to share if for some reason that isn't actually true information anymore. And then we can do some quality control around it. But part of the joy is this is our community is who supplies the information. And if you look and there isn't much in terms of access information for sites near you, we would adore it if you wanted to submit. And we're really excited about that. Valerie, I see you have your hand up.
Trying to get my microphone to work.
There you are.
One of the things I've noticed here is that the accessible trails are all separate and aside from the usual normal trail. And my experience of that is that I feel like I'm being discriminated against. And I've very recently been invited to participate in developing a trail at Manomet. And what they're saying is, again, it's going to be a separate and isolated trail. I'm put off by that, and I don't know how to get around it, how to say, look, just take part of your trail and make it accessible. I mean, out and back is fine, you know. If you want to put a loop somewhere, that's fine. But I just don't like being told I have to go somewhere else. I can't go where everyone else goes. And I'm wondering if anyone else runs into that.
Virginia or Mark, would you like to comment on that? On the tendency, I think that sometimes parks or public lands or nature preserves have of creating an accessible trail that is sometimes separate and perhaps less natural, if you will.
I just recently, as part of a group of friends of our local bird sanctuary, met with the park board who owns the property, and they're redeveloping a boardwalk which has been inaccessible to anybody for the last 10 years. And, you know, they started off thinking about making this boardwalk and the trail connects to fully ADA compliant. And to connect it to the main trail in a loop would have required a lot of destruction of trees, et cetera, that wasn't necessary. And we were able to convince them along the lines of what Valerie was saying, that make it ADA compliant out, and then we'll just turn around and come back, and the rest of the trail can be whatever it is. If someone wants to try it, fine, but we don't have to have the most stringent criteria for the whole thing, because it really could damage the entire area. If you really are going to limit your slopes to 15 degrees and everything, you've got so many trails just to get over a little hill.
You bet.
Sometimes it's not useful. One of the other things I was going to say, though, Valerie, when I go to strange places that I don't know, one of the best guides that I found to get out in the woods is to use mixed use trails that are bicycle and pedestrian. I don't like bicycle trails alone because people are going along 20 miles an hour and they're not looking for you.
Mhm.
But if it's bicycle, then it's going to be a smoother pavement. And if it's mixed use, then it's a little safer. And those are longer too, so that if you're able to go longer distance, you can really do that. I mean, that's in the absence of someone actually describing a trail on the birdability map. So, and I agree with you. The fully ADA compliant loops, unless they're in national parks where they're from a parking lot and it's really a scenic overlook, and then sure, the scenic overlook ought to be compliant, but everybody uses that pathway. I don't like that idea either, because it's really going to be limited terrain that you get to traverse.
This brings up such a great conversation piece or discussion, which is, there are so many, I'm going to both hand us again, because there are so many different approaches. And I think all of them are appropriate in different places and spaces. And so one of the things that makes me think about, as you're saying that, Mark, is how different it is when the design takes into account access and accessibility from the outset, right? It's not a retrofitting. And I think that that's a big thing to be considering, because when we're talking about retrofitting or going back and redeveloping a trail, we're talking about having very limited ability sometimes to do that without having impact to the ecosystem. Whereas Virginia, I'm thinking about, for example, Blair Woods and Blair Woods Nature Preserve in Austin that we recently got to bird together at. From the outset, as they were developing the trail system within that, the goal was for it to be as accessible as possible. And because of that, the very design itself was able to take into account, Mark, some of what you're saying, and Valerie, some of what you're saying, which is we recognize when we work with the land that changes the ability to create slope, for example, that's going to be appropriate. Can you talk a little bit about that, Virginia?
Sure. When when we decided to make sure that we had surveyed for an accessible trail, we we had a designer who did an amazing job, and the trail is accessible, and it's a very nice loop. I mean, I think it's, I'm not sure exactly how long, maybe a mile.
Little over, I think, even.
Okay. That's not to say that there aren't walkable trails kind of intersecting every now and then through there.
Yep.
So, people are obviously, who can, are obviously going to take off of the accessible trail. And I don't have any problem with that. So, and I agree with you that the idea of an accessible trail needs to be at the very beginning of a plan, not an
Whenever
asterisk.
possible.
Yeah,
Yes.
not an asterisk at the end.
Yes.
And but I was also trying to think about times where I had felt relegated
Mm,
to an accessible trail, and I can only think of one in
mm,
all of my wanderings. And it may just be that I naturally tend, like Mark said,
mm,
toward the bike trails, or toward
mhm,
the rails to trails, or
mhm,
toward the mixed use trails. I mean,
mhm.
if it's a trail, I'm on it. I don't
Yep.
care. I don't look to see, whether it's
Mhm.
accessible. I figure that out when I get
Yep.
there. But I share your feelings. Definitely, I would add one other thing to that,
Mhm.
though, which is, and I think this is so important for all of us to remember, that when we're talking about accessible trails, we are not just talking about disabled people. We're
Exactly.
talking about people at all life stages. We're
Mhm.
talking about grandparents with strollers. We're talking about moms with,
Mhm.
new babies. We're talking
Mhm.
about people who just had knee surgery. We're talking about
Mhm.
people who are experiencing COPD. So
Mhm.
in that way, it is all inclusive. Do you know what I mean? It is for those of us who
Yes.
want to be able to be outside without a visible disability, perhaps, or just aging.
I so appreciate that. And I do think that that's one of the sort of pieces that has been so important to lift up, is that while our focus is on folks with disabilities and chronic health concerns, that almost always that it benefits in a much larger way any of us who age, which hopefully is all of us. And so
Right.
just, sort of naming that. I'm really curious because I can't believe we're just 10 minutes left in our conversation today. I always have way more conversation questions than we have time for. But I'm really curious about Virginia and Mark, what kind of advice either of you would give to someone with a disability who's interested in birding, but maybe isn't sure where to start, feels a little bit uncertain about access. And what would your advice, or what kinds of words would you share with them about how
Well,
to
my answer, if you live in Minnesota, just Google birding or any of the Audubon chapters, and you're going to find their events. And like I said, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon, which is
Yes.
fantastic, and advertising accessible events or whatnot, or look for events that are at a bird feeder. I've started
Yeah.
doing a lot of events where we just sit and do slow birding at a bird feeder. You see more birds, and then it's accessible for people with, who use a walker, who had knee surgery, whatever, who just don't want to walk far. Or they could call Birdability and find out who their local captain is. I'm
Yes.
sure I speak for myself and probably most of the captains. I would love to hear from more people. I put my name and email down on the events that I lead anyway.
Yes.
So, but if you don't know where to start and you know the word Birdability, you can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Find community is part of what it sounds like. Just reach out, find community. You are, I think that you and Virginia are part of why there are so many accessible outings now being advertised for events. And this is a good question. Is accessible a bad word when advertising events? We have somebody asking, hesitant to use it because it doesn't really include everyone. I think that I would be curious to hear you all's thoughts about that. I think accessible often does become it's a code word isn't the right thing, but it's a signifier, right? That an accessible event is something that is taking into account access. Virginia, what are your thoughts about that?
I think people are so excited to see the word accessible.
Yes.
And I don't just think these are people with obvious mobility issues.
Exactly.
I really am finding that when I advertise in Austin accessible events, more and more of the people who are showing up are people in their 60s and 70s who want to be birding but are ready to not have to be in a hardcore group. They are interested in being with groups who are more what's the word, more interested in the process and of the watching the birds and spending time with the birds and not racing around making a checklist. That's what I think accessible means. I also appreciate what your nuance question addresses, which is it going to turn some people off? And I guess my answer to that would be maybe they are people that shouldn't be there.
I love the term accessible. I love that what you're naming, Virginia, which is in part accessible is the flag of we are going to work really hard towards inclusivity, right? We are working to provide access and inclusiveness for folks interested in joining us. And And I think that if the concern is also partly about, I don't want to identify something as accessible because what if it isn't accessible for someone else? I
Mm,
think that's a different concern, and that there is another way of going about that, which is to say, please tell us what access would mean for you.
right.
Often what we talk about with birdability captains and events is having folks, whenever possible, register for those events, because that does give you the opportunity to ask about, are there things that would make this accessible for you? Tell us about your access needs. And I know, Virginia, you or Mark or myself, we're delighted then to take into account, right? I know, for example, one recent event that I had was disability pride and queer pride outing. And one of the things that someone shared with me was that they really needed there to be a shade option, because the sun, it was, late June, early July, the sun was something that would have not been possible for them due to some of their chronic health conditions and medications. And so one of the things we were able to do was address that need by saying we're going to hold it primarily as a sitting event, as a big sit under a pavilion, with the opportunity for folks to go out and come back on a nearby trail. So it was a little bit of everything for everyone. Some of us staying put, some of us going out on the trail, but really having the opportunity to say, tell us what you need, which is what access and inclusion are about, right?
Right, exactly. And that is the part of mission part number 3, which is
Yeah,
creating a welcoming and inclusive
exactly.
um, environment. And that's why I, like Mark, invite people, openly invite people, call me if you have any
Yes,
questions.
yes,
And, just as a way to be transparent and available and receptive to
yes.
anything around the word accessibility.
Mhm. I really appreciate one of our participants, Jamie, who is also a captain, put in advertising that people can reach out to facilitators ahead of time to ask questions is so important. If nobody had done that, I wouldn't have ever gone on my first trip. And I
Right.
think, that is one of the things that we know, is that just saying, tell us what you need, here's how you can reach us, and is a really huge part of that access and inclusion. Coming up to the end of our time, Virginia and Mark, I'm curious if you could talk just a little bit about your hopes for the future of accessible birding, personally or organizationally for birdability, or generally for the movement at large, because we are a movement. This is a growing movement of people working towards creating an accessible world through creating accessible birding.
Mark, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think we're starting to see it, which
Yeah.
is people beyond our organization are thinking of accessibility when they're planning events. And at
Mhm.
minimum, they're at least trying to describe what you're going to encounter,
Yeah.
leave it up to you, which is what I like to do too. And we're trying to do that for
Mhm.
our own Audubon chapter, even if they're not
Yeah.
events that are specifically designed to be more
Mhm.
accessible. The fact that people all over have heard of birdability,
Yeah.
which means they're aware of it. And hopefully they're aware one level below that of what does that mean?
Yes.
Oh, you mean we have to actually think about these things for people who have various disabilities or limitations. Don't call them
Mhm.
disabilities again. Uh,
Mhm.
I don't feel like I'm not all that energetic today. It doesn't matter
Yeah,
why. Uh,
exactly.
but I still want to see some birds. What could I do? Okay, where can
Mhm.
I go? Can I
Yeah,
go with a group? Do I have to do it by myself? So that's my dream for the future. More of that.
I
Well,
love that.
well, my hope is that I get help. I need more help. I am desperately needing help because
Mhm.
all these organizations are
Yes.
calling me to do
Mhm.
presentations and
Yes.
to conduct walks to help
Yes.
people successfully identify and assess their birding sites. It's, yeah, just this weekend, it was the Parkinson's group in Galveston,
Yeah.
and add to that the whole city of Galveston.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, anybody who thinks they can jump on board and help me do this work, I need you.
Yes. And that is how Birdability began. Virginia
know,
saying, I need you. Come, come, I need you.
I
And
need
we
help.
do. There's so much work to be done in every community across the country, Canada and beyond. And we really are working so hard to help give tools so that people can do this work in their own communities. And thank you for naming that, Virginia. I think we desperately need you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this movement, because by attending, you are by fact a part of this movement. And now we can't wait to see what you do with this information. And so excited about the ways that accessible birding will continue to grow, and that birding from these trails and birdability sites and birding sites across the country will continue to be pinned on the Birdability Map and will grow together. And I'm so grateful. Thank you for being here, you all. We are right at the top of the hour, and I'm going to just remind you that we have another conversation February 12th, where we'll be talking about an introduction to mindful birding. It came up several times: slow birding, mindful birding, ways of really being with the birds. So please plan to join us then. And I can't thank you enough for being here. Have a
Hey,
wonderful rest of your day.
Kat, can you put my email out?